Hey everyone, in this video, I'm just going to briefly talk about the Cooper text. As you'll notice, I'm not really going to provide a usual kind of lecture where I take up all the different things within the chapter or the chapters for the week. Rather, I'm going to take one or two points and talk further about them a little bit, just to take up, some points of interest for myself and things that I think are important for you to learn and to kind of think about as well. So curriculum, obviously this week's topic is curriculum broadly. We're going to start looking at curricular documents. Um, so Cooper talks about, this kind of content skills divide. And this has been an ongoing debate, an ongoing conversation in educational circles for almost time immemorial, almost as long as we've had compulsory and kind of major systems of education. There's always been this conversation about whether students need to learn content. And by content, we mean, facts and dates and things. So for example, if we're looking at, drama or art, looking at specific works of specific artists, or looking at specific dramatical plays, or looking at particular scripts, so learning things. Versus skills. And skills is more that students are able to do something after they're done studying. So for example, if we're looking at art and drama, perhaps, we are more concerned with our students being able to draw and paint and being able to carry out a dramatic performance or being able to act. So the proponents of a content kind of school argue that there are basic things that we need all of our students to know. So all students graduating Ontario's schools should know specific things, either about Canada or the world or whatever it may be, that, there are basic knowledges that we need every single citizen to know. Whereas people in the skills camp, so to speak, are more inclined to think that content is easily forgotten, right? I think a lot of us can refer back to our own schooling experiences and where you learn a lot of content, you learn a lot of details and information, but that information is forgotten shortly after the ending of your formal schooling and that you don't really revisit again, right? So these proponents of the skills argue that it's more important for us to focus on the skills, the lifelong learning skills, to think critically, to empathize, to communicate. So those kind of skills are more important to develop than the content that'll be forgotten, because the skills are what stays with the student for the rest of their lives. So this debate tends to shift from one side to the other. Not ironically, but interestingly enough, usually kind of aligned with a political. Usually content is associated with a little bit more of a right wing and skills a bit more of a left wing look at education. Right now we're currently seeing the shift a little bit more towards skills. It varies province to province, but even Ontario now is moving towards skills a little bit. So you will see in the curricular documents, whereas the old documents, the PDFs, are extremely long and extremely detailed. What we're seeing now is that with the new documents that are being released by the Ministry of Education, the new curricular documents, they tend to be a little bit more streamlined and they tend to focus a little bit more on skills versus on content. That being said, I think a great educator is somebody who is cognizant of both content and skills. I must say that I'm a little bit more inclined to be with a skill camp than I am with a content camp. So I do have that bias. In Inevitably, so will each and every one of you. Usually one will kind of lean towards one or the other. Of course, you may kind of feel that both are equally as important. But regardless of what your stance or belief is, it is very important that you teach both content and skills. And the curricular documents, as we have seen, and as you'll see further throughout this course in your program, they do mandate that you teach both skills and content. So you can't really do one without the other. So that's something to always keep in mind. So think about, in the reflection activities following this video, really take some time to think about, am I inclined to think that particular information is very important, or am I inclined to think that particular skills are very important? And think about how that may influence you to downplay the one that you think is perhaps less important. So that's a really kind of important distinction here, an important thing to consider as you're moving through with planning, because you will also, like I mentioned, have to always think about what skills are you trying to teach and what content is going to be included. And sometimes you may decide that, a skill is more important. So perhaps to think critically is more important. And then that in turn will put content likely in a secondary position, where your content is used as a means to an end to teach critical thinking. Whereas if you're thinking that the content, for perhaps you're doing, ancient societies, you may think that learning about particular, for example, like, indigenous nations to Canada might be content-wise a very important thing to learn, and that the skills come secondary. So the how to think critically and how to analyze information, these are secondary to learning about indigenous peoples in Canada. I'm not saying that one is right and one is wrong. Everybody's going to have their own preference, but what you need to keep in mind is that you'll tend to lean to the one at the expense of the other, in that you should never forget the one that you perhaps think is secondary. Another thing that, sorry, I'm just going to move my little video down so you can see. Another thing that Cooper begins to introduce, and the whole book is really based on this, and you'll see this theme of differentiation going through every single chapter almost. Differentiation has been and is a really big topic right now in education, in part because no longer are schools allowing students who perhaps students who have difficulties learning or perhaps are not as successful as other students. Schools and school boards are no longer allowing those students to be placed solely in special education classes. And this is done for good reason, because research shows that students, all students who require additional help or additional modifications, and students who do not, everybody benefits from being together. Segregating students into special education classrooms is shown to really be negative for both the students who are in those classrooms and also the regular students who stay in the mainstream class. And the main reason, you may wonder, well, how could the mainstream students be at a disadvantage? It's because they're not being exposed to students who are different from them. And this really feeds into this whole individualism and meritocratic stance of our education system, where we have one standard and we judge students based on their ability to meet said standard or not. Cooper really pushes back against this assertion. And I will say here and throughout this course that differentiation is arguably one of the hardest things to do as a teacher. So if it looks really overwhelming and it looks really challenging, do not worry, it is overwhelming and it's challenging. And we're not expecting for you to step into your classroom on day one and differentiate to every single student. This is a process and it takes time and experience, but it is something that you need to think about right away. Oftentimes we will, design activities or design lessons and units that are geared towards the average student. So we have students that are above the average who do really well, and then we also have students who are below the average and don't do really well. Unfortunately, when we design our lessons to meet the average, what happens is that the students who are at the top are not being challenged enough, and that's where you get boredom and you get disengagement. Alternatively, students who are perhaps a little bit below the average, they're struggling and they're having a hard time because the instruction and the content is too difficult for them to do. So once again, resulting in disengagement and students often shutting down. So what we must try to do is when we're planning and we're thinking about how we're going to design our courses and our units and our lessons, we need to think about all of the learners, all of the students in your class. The nice thing about being a primary teacher is that you tend to work with the same students all day long, as opposed to somebody like me who's seeing different students in different blocks. So the nice thing about this is that it allows you to really get to know your students over a period of time. We're not expecting that you're going to jump right in and know every single thing about them and know exactly what everybody needs. This is an ongoing process, right? So what we need to do is take account of all student skills and abilities as well as interests. And our goal is to have our students continuously be in the zone of proximal development. And this is a bit of a theoretical term, might be a little unclear, but it's fairly straightforward. It's done by a comrade of mine, a Russian guy named Vygotsky. He wrote about this in the 70s. But basically, all zone of proximal development basically states is that in the middle, we can see that what the learner can do unaided. So if you're teaching a grade 2 class, you may have some students who know, their ABCs, and you may have students who can already write and stuff like that. Um, the zone of proximal and on the outside of a ring is something that the learner cannot do at all. So, for example, if I gave a grade 2 student, War and Peace by Tolstoy, and asked them to read it and tell me everything about it, they can't do this at all. Even if I were to help them. But what we want to do is we want to design our learning activities and the things that we'll be teaching to be in the zone of proximal development, where the learner can do something with your guidance. Basically meaning that, for a grade 2 student who already knows how to write, we may not want to focus on the letters of the alphabet. We may not want to focus on, sentence starters if it already knows how to do this without you. But we also don't want to jump so far that we're really not meeting the student. It's way too challenging. Even with our guidance, I can't do this. What we want to do is find tasks that are challenging enough for them to do with your guidance, right? So if we have a student who already knows how to write sentences, perhaps we want to move them over to writing paragraphs. And that way, it's something that they're learning, they're being challenged, but it's not so challenging that the student has almost zero chance of success at the task. So basically, differentiation, when we think about zone of proximal development, is that we must tailor content and content and instruction to meet the students of where we are and also where we have to go. The challenge with this is in a classroom is that you're going to have many different students who are going to be at many different places. So they're all going to have not all of them, but you'll have many different zones of proximal development. So what our first task to do when we're planning is we need to look at our classroom. Oftentimes, you will have colleagues who've taught these students in the past. Often you can look at their past report cards, all those sort of materials will give you an idea of where they're at. We also can do our own pre-assessment activities. So for example, pre-assessment activities are not for grades. It's just meant to tell you exactly where the students are. Pre-assessments are also sometimes called baseline assessments. So basically what a pre-assessment can do is, if you look at your curriculum, so for example, if we're doing grade 4 social studies, and we can see that all the content of the skills that we have to cover, because it'll say by the end of grade 4, each student should be able to do A, B, and C. So we want to start to see where our students are in relation to a lot of these content and skills. Do they know, the capital of Canada? Can they write a paragraph? Can they write a sentence? And as you get these pieces, and this is something that should be ongoing throughout all of your teaching, it'll give you an idea of where the students are and where they have to go, thereby telling you where the zone of proximal development is. The challenge is, like I said, is that you need to create a range of activities that allow students to work both on what they're good at and where they need to improve. Because basically, oftentimes we think of differentiation, we can think of tailoring it to their interests or to their abilities, right? So if a student is a hands-on learner, we always want to do hands-on activities. Or if a student loves to read, we always want to give them something that they want to read. We definitely want to pique their students' interest, and we definitely want them to be engaged with what they're doing. However, we can't solely focus on something that they're already good at, right? So we also have to challenge them and have them do tasks that perhaps are going to be building on where we need to improve. That being said, we don't always want to bombard our students with tasks that are too difficult for them, or tasks that are so challenging that a student starts to feel like they're a failure and that they can't keep up. So we always need to moderate these kind of activities. Also, a specific activity needs to be applicable to every single student in your class. And this is where it gets quite challenging, because you may look at a classroom of 30 students and you may have, 2 that are below level for perhaps reading. You'll have some that are above. You'll have some students that are below in numeracy, some that are above. And this is where the challenge really gets in. But one way to really try to overcome this challenge is preemptively when you're planning, think about how your activities in your content will cover everybody, the whole spectrum of your students. So basically, when I teach and when I'm, entering a classroom, I will look at the class roster, I'll see kind of where they're at, I'll do some pre-assessments. And for example, when I taught last spring, I had two students with an IEP, so an individualized education plan. One had trouble with processing and needed more time. I had a number of students who were English language learners, so they were kind of going through this process. So for example, anytime I would give a piece of text, instead of just giving them a little piece of text and saying, read it and answer the questions, or read it and write a response on it, what I would do is I would do what we call scaffolding. And scaffolding, it sounds kind of like exactly what it's like at a construction site, where we kind of build supports to help the students build their own abilities. So for example, instead of offering only a challenging text, I would also sometimes paraphrase it into more simple English. So for the students who are learning English, they can read the adapted text. It doesn't mean that the only text that's presented is adapted. However, I have two different options. So there are students who can read at grade level or above grade level can read the harder text, and the students who perhaps are not as strong at reading can read the adapted text, which I paraphrase into a little more simple English. Right, so that's one first way that I can differentiate this. The second part is that, based on students' preferences, some students may have a hard time reading text and understanding wholly what we're talking about just by reading it by themselves. So often what I'll do is I will read the text out, or I will provide a video that kind of complements the text to give the students an idea of what we're talking about. I may have students, I'm not a big fan of read alouds, but I may have students work in small groups together to work on a text together. And I may design mixability groups, or perhaps pairing some of my strongest students with some of my not strongest students to work together. These are some of the examples that are of differentiation. And like I said, this is, not something that you're going to get right away. And it's something that's going to be ongoing for you. But considering that this class is, our course here is based on planning and thinking about how you're going to plan, the first step you really want to do is think about, is my unit, lesson, activity accessible to all of my students, right? So if we think about, if we had a student in perhaps a wheelchair in our phys ed class, we probably wouldn't require all students to do something required with going up and down stairs, for example, right? That's just not equitable and it's not accessible. Likewise, in a math class, we're not going to expect all students to be able to know how to do fractions, because that's penalizing students who perhaps don't know how to do them and advantaging the ones that already do know how to do them, right? However, what our role is to develop learning activities that allow students to start from where they're at and work towards the next goal. That's the main point of differentiation. As I mentioned, I'll talk more about this in the weeks to come. It's really going to be a foundational part of this course and also the Cooper text that you're reading. So something to keep in mind as you move forward, particularly if you're planning. That's it for now. Enjoy the rest of the module. Hopefully it all makes sense. And yeah, I'll talk to you later. Take care.